Hi, this is John Rosenhead, the Jerusalem psychotherapist. This week's Torah and Psychology post for Parshas Sisa is going to discuss the intergenerational cycle of abuse. In this week's Parsha, we have the pasuk that says, "Poked avon avos al banim ve'al bnei banim ve'al shleishim ve'al rebaim," which means that the children, the grandchildren, even to the third and fourth generation will suffer because of the sins of their fathers. And this suggests that the future generations will suffer because of the sins of their fathers. But the Gemara in Brachas asks on this and says, surely it doesn't make sense that children should suffer because of their fathers. As there is a passage that says, "Ubanim lo yamusu al avos," that the children will not suffer because of their father's sin. So there's a contradiction between these two psukim. And the Gemara tries to resolve this contradiction by saying that the children that will suffer because of the sins of their father are the ones that continue in the evil path, that continue the sinful ways of their father, and therefore they too will suffer. Whereas the children that break this cycle and do not continue in the evil ways of their father will not suffer. So what we see is that the implication from this Gemara is that children are both, the children that suffer because of their parents are both victims of the sinful ways of their father, but also then become sinners in themselves. There's a two-way process of both being a victim of the father's sin, and also perpetuating this pattern. This continues as an intergenerational pattern, even as the pasuk says, even to the third and fourth generation. And this relates, from a psychological perspective, to the intergenerational cycle of abuse, which is that there's a common held belief that abuse breeds abuse, that children that grow up in an environment of where their parents are violent and abusive, there's maltreatment and neglect, will they themselves develop to become parents that are abusive. And it suggests there's a cycle here, that children perpetuate this abuse, and it continues through the generations, an intergenerational pattern. And whereas this is a common held belief of abuse breeds abuse, the research suggests that it's not necessarily inevitable. There's not necessarily a causal link of understanding of a child that grows up in an abusive home will then become an abusive parent as well. As the research shows, there are a number of mediating factors that have to be taken into account, such as the mental health, the level of violence between the parents, so intimate partner violence, also the age of becoming a parent. And also there's a suggestion looking at the emotional regulation and substance abuse. So you need to take in there are multiple variables that need to be taken into account when looking at this phenomenon of abuse, of a child becoming an abusive parent, and what contributes towards that. And we don't necessarily have, from the research up until now, a causal link. We need to look at different associations and different variables. But certainly from the research, there is this indication that children that grow up in an environment where there's abuse and neglect are at a higher risk of becoming abusive parents themselves. And this is because the home environment and the relationship with the parent is the primary source and the primary environment where they learn and contribute and leads to their development into becoming an adult. And therefore, they will copy what they see. If they're exposed to violence, then they themselves will then continue and imitate that behavior with their own children. Or there's a sense of insecure attachment. The relationship with the parent is vital to how they then continue through, how they are able to learn to regulate their emotions and how they develop healthy relationships. So if there's an insecure attachment, that they had an abusive and neglectful relationship with their own parents, this affects their own future relationships with their children. Or from a psychodynamic perspective, there's a sense of trying to repress this trauma, the childhood trauma, through denial and minimization of what they experience, which will then hamper the process of healing and being able to process the trauma, and this will continue to affect how their parenting and the way that they parent their own children. So how does a person break this cycle? How, as the Gemara says, how does a child break this cycle to not continue the evil and abusive path of their parents? So we can look at it from a quantitative point of view. That there's research that has looked at comparing children that suffered abuse from their parents, but looking at certain families that did not continue the cycle, were able to break the abusive pattern, and families that were not able and continued this cycle. What was the difference between them? And through an analysis, quantitative analysis, they found that children that then grow up with a safe, nurturing, and stable relationship, whether it's intimate relationship with their spouse or whether it's a mother and child relationship, that environment, that nurturing relationship provides the healing environment for the trauma that they experienced as a child to be able to ensure that the cycle is broken. But as we said, and the research also highlights this, that there isn't necessarily a causal relationship. We need to look at it further. Further research is necessary to understand if there are causal variables. And therefore, it is important to also have a qualitative understanding, to look at the subjective perspective of what actually happens for each person, why for them it is easier or more of a challenge to break the cycle. So from a qualitative research, they looked at fathers, particularly at the stage of the perinatal stage, where before becoming a parent, and they interviewed fathers to try to see how they understood this transition, this stage of becoming a parent, and how it relates to breaking the cycle of violence. And from the interviews, they found that they looked at the fathers' understanding, how they understood violence, their conceptualization of fatherhood, and their understanding of breaking the cycle. And all these, from this perspective, from this qualitative research, it gained a subjective, phenomenological, a subjective understanding of the experience of the fathers and how they understood the cycle of violence. And this would be able to, it's an important insight into being able to work with people on an individual level, working with families on an individual level, creating interventions that can help to identify and understand what contributes towards the violence, what contributes towards perpetuating this cycle, and how we can help each individual person in their own individual case to try to break this cycle. So with any change, as we understand, change is difficult. It is very challenging, but change can happen. This cycle of violence can be broken. And through this, it can help for children to grow up happy and healthy for future generations. Have a great Shabbos and keep well.